Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place for all things public information related for police, fire, EMS, and local government. An open forum to learn, grow, and develop your public information skills. Your host, Robert Tornabene, is a public information officer with over 10 years in the field and 27 years of law enforcement background. In each episode, we will explore different aspects of the public information officer profession. Weekly, we will delve into the field of public information by talking to other PIOs. So sit back and enjoy this episode.
Good afternoon. Today on the PIO Podcast, we're going to switch roles. My friend and colleague, Christine Townsend from the PIO Toolkit, is going to turn the tables on me and interview me, Robert Tornabene from the PIO Podcast. So, sit back, enjoy, and let us know how we did. Christine, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert. I am so excited to be able to turn the tables on you because, let's face it, you have interviewed now getting on for over, nearly 30 people, I would say, since you've started PIO Podcast. And you're the one that's always asking the questions. I wonder why. We're going to find out. But I thought it'd be really, really interesting to talk to you because you've got 27 years plus experience in law enforcement and at least 10, but probably more without realizing it, as a public information officer. You're involved in the Illinois PIO Association, and you've sort of spoken and also written articles for a number of publications, including Law Enforcement Today and Police One. You've given training to people. You get asked to go and do all sorts of consulting work with people. You generally are the go-to guy, crisis comms. But we came to meet because we spoke on our PIO podcast interview. So what I want to do is kind of just let you introduce yourself a little bit more rather than just the PIO podcast. Well, tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I started my career at a smaller police department before I moved to the department that I was with for 27 years. My experience in law enforcement was I always wanted to be in law enforcement. So I was going to school for it. I was interviewing at, I couldn't tell you how many police departments I went through the process and eventually ended up getting hired at the first one. And then after I graduated the academy, I was in field training. Great, and then got hired by the department I was with for 27 years, which was the Niles Police Department. And that is a suburb of the city of Chicago, but it is literally borderlines the city of Chicago on the north side. So we have O'Hare Airport and the city of Chicago that border us. My background in getting involved in comms and PIO kind of started out by pretty much day one when I was first started. I was asked about a week into my career in the department while I was still an FTO, I was asked to go speak to a group of kids at a school because they didn't have anybody. It was on day shift and they're all the old timers. Nobody wanted to talk to anybody. And they said, could you go talk to these kids about crime prevention stuff? And at the time I knew very limited amount. And I went out there and I kind of winged it. Supervisor watched me do it. And he says, you really have a knack for that. We're going to develop that. And over the period in my career as I started going, I became the first community policing officer in my department. I became the first school resource officer in my department. And I kind of turned that into community outreach, talking to parents, talking to kids, talking to seniors. I created a senior crime prevention program that dealt with crimes that just target senior citizens. And as I was going through that development, I decided I'm going to get promoted. Or I should say, I want to get promoted, took a test for sergeant. And as I was going through that process, our current PIO at the time was an old timer and he wanted out of that position. His version of being the PIO was redact information, leave the reports at the desk, never send any information out. Don't talk to the media if you don't have to. Don't answer questions in the media. And I was always about talk to the public, talk to the media, give them the information. And as a matter of fact, I had done a couple interviews that made newspapers and so on. When I got promoted, they're like, you want to be the PIO? And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I'm just newly promoted. And like, yeah, we know, but in a year or two, do you want to be the PIO? And I'm like, sure. And a couple years later, after being a sergeant for a few years in patrol, and they're like, you're going into PIO. That day, the first day I was a PIO, we had an employee that got decided he was going to fake his own robbery, victim of a robbery.
Wow.
And I happened to be in court that day, and I'm walking out of court, turn my radio on, and all of a sudden turn my phone on, and all of a sudden my phone's blowing up, my radio's blowing up, and they're like, yeah, we got one of our employees got stabbed and robbed. And I'm going over the scene, and I did my first scene, blood everywhere in the roadway. And I did this whole interview for a stringer. Up by us, stringers are very common. They're the impromptu, not contractual, the for hire cameramen that do interviews remotely, and then they'll submit it to the different news services and they'll pay for it. And I did my first on-camera interview that day about this employee that we had thought had been held up by two men. Turned out he faked the whole thing. We figured it out later that day. Like 2 days later, we ended up charging him with the crime. So I had to deal with not only the robbery that was a big risk to the community and the public because it occurred right in a very friendly park in the community, but then we turned around, we had a corrupt employee, and at the same time I'm dealing with certain media outlets, particularly print media outlets, that were calling him a police officer and he was a civilian employee. So at the same time I'm dealing with negative aspect of police officers and corruption, but it was a civilian employee. But then I had to do crisis realigning their viewpoint of what a police employee was and not a sworn police officer. I had to really highlight that. And let me tell you, that really made me realize that I needed to learn bridging statements. I had not been through any training yet, and I was in big trouble. And I lucked out. A couple weeks later. I was able to go to some training that the local FBI office in Chicago put on. There is a really well-known FBI public affairs person named Ross Rice that used to work for the Chicago FBI. He held this 2.5-day class where literally you learned everything. And then he took you to a couple news stations, and you sat through a news cycle where they went from the interview, or I should say their morning meeting, and then you got to see the broadcast as it laid out. So that was where I started really. I really realized I needed to get training.
Mm-hmm. And that was no doubt baptism by fire. And I think every good PIO has one, and they learn quickly if they're any good at all. And it's like ding, 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 ticked every little box that you needed to learn very, very quickly. But it's obviously the making of you, and you didn't give up. So I know you developed further into that. And did you develop a love of learning about it, or was it doing the job and then you realized
it was
I need to do this?
It was a combination. I know I after that incident, I was like, okay, I need to go to training, because you can't just do this job. This is not, anybody can just do this job and then hope for the best, because you could say the wrong thing and it gets taken out of context, and you think you're saying the right thing, in reality you're not, and you're jeopardizing the reputation of your agency and your own personal future. So I really asked for training, and I went to a couple of training classes. There were a few that were put on, and then our local training unit that the state holds has a 2-day course that I went through. And there was a PIO from Aurora PD that who did set up a course. And Aurora is a pretty large community here in Metro Chicago area. He set up a course where he brought individual reporters in, and they helped walk you through like the questions that they were targeting you with and asking, and hoping to get the little sound bites, teaching you the pitfalls that you can get yourself into trouble with. And that was where I was really starting to learn. And a few years later, of course, well, this was many years later, but the FBI LEADA classes started to come out, Judy Pell's classes, and I grabbed on anything and everything that I could get my hands on to continue to learn, because this is a continuous learning job.
Do you find that you're still learning?
Every day. And part of the process of learning every day is reading constantly, interacting with other PIOs, reading what reporters put out, and hearing and reading other press releases from law enforcement agencies, because it's, you learn, like, you learn what not to do sometimes by just seeing an interview on TV, and you're like, oh, that was bad. That was a bad phrase.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I'm constantly trying to better myself. Yes, I'm always learning.
And I think the key in my mind is not having the arrogance to think you know what you're doing all the time. You've seen it all, shouldn't be doing the job. And I think we've all done those bad interviews, and we've all seen those bad interviews. And anyone who says they've done a perfect interview every time is not doing many interviews.
Oh God, no. I have. There's an outtake that somebody did in my department from an accident that occurred. It was a motor vehicle, double fatal motor vehicle accident, and I was doing an on-scene interview, and I made the phrase. It was a left turn accident. A car hit their vehicle as they're turning left, and I made the mistake of saying it's a T-bone accident. And I had somebody create a little meme video with a car and a T-bone, and it's like, oh God, that was brutal. My own people did that too. So that was
that's nice.
That was one of those things where you kind of learn your words very carefully as you go through those.
Having a good sense of humor, I think, stands you in good stead, regardless of what happens. So, and you mentioned memes, actually. You've been in the career long enough to see that technological change, cultural shift, actually, in the way law enforcement handles the media, and actually not even handles now, I would say, engages with, which is probably very different from even 10, 15 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 or whatever whoever, still around. But what would you say you have seen change the most, both in a positive and negative way, with the advent of like technology and the internet?
So there's a couple of things that come to mind. First off, when I first became the PIO, I remember the old PIO would just redact reports, leave them at the front desk. And it was extremely cumbersome for the reporters to get that information, because they had to come in and sift through reports. And half the time they didn't care about any of those reports because they weren't anything noteworthy. And so one of the first things I did is I kind of automated those. I made those digital so that I could just email them out or make them available through a website where they could go and just look at them. And that was like the first thing that I kind of realized, that technology is going to make life easier for us, because it makes it so much easier for us to share information to the public and the media, as opposed to they've got to come in and read a report, or you got to come in and get a report, or I have to fax a report. I don't have to do that. I can email you the report. So I think that is one of the positives. I think one of the other positives or negatives that we run into is right now there's such a push for transparency. The transparency that we as law enforcement want to put out is a good thing, because it helps the public realize what we're doing. At the same time, we forget that the public wants to be spoon-fed information sometimes. And we can't just rely on push information out and say, go look at it on this website, because it's all there. Sometimes you have to put that information out in little bits and pieces so that everybody knows that this is what's happening or what the agency is doing, as opposed to just say, go look at this website, because the general public in a crisis is not going to go look at that. Technology really has changed the way we do, from doing on-camera interviews all by yourself, where you could actually set up your own camera on a scene, do a video, shoot it out to the news media and say, there's your interview. If you need one, you don't have to wait for a stringer to show up. Or it could just simply be by doing what we're doing here, where we're doing a Zoom link interview, where we didn't have this ability to do 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You had to wait for the reporter to show up to your door to do the interview. Now we can do it right over the internet. It's definitely so much easier now to communicate. And
would you say,
go ahead.
Sorry, would you say though that just because the technology is advanced, that may have gone in double time, yet the skills, expertise and training is still slower to get when it comes to support from command teams or senior management? Just because you've got the technology doesn't mean you know how to work it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always a technology gremlin, but there's always the cost behind all that technology. So, One of the biggest issues I ran into when I first started doing video was, how do you edit video? You can't use like the Windows Movie Maker to edit video all the time. It's not very good. So you either got to pay for like an Adobe Creative Cloud suite, or at the time Premiere Pro when it was all by itself, and try and go to your leadership and say, I need to spend $900 on a computer program so I can edit video. And they're like, yeah, okay, right. They look at you like you're crazy. Well, now there's programs out there that are much cheaper that you can do that with, but back then it was certainly not. And the learning curve was incredibly high. So when you didn't have the ability to get on YouTube and learn how to do something, where I definitely say that a good chunk of sometimes my individual learning is, I don't know how to do it. I'm going to go to YouTube. I'm going to watch a few videos and I'm going to play with it and learn how to do it the right way. So yeah, definitely technology is usually behind the learning curve when the new technology comes out.
And do you feel though that almost some solo PIOs, because I know you've spent a lot of time on your own, but I mean, a lot of people, they're either solo PIOs or part of a team. Do you find that perhaps that learning and having to learn because you are on your own equips you more to deal with things in the future? Or do you feel that, having a team will probably make you a better PIO? Well,
I think that's kind of a mixed bag. I think being an individual PIO, or even a part-time PIO, because in reality that was what I was, because I was still a sworn officer doing other duties. You learn how to work quick. You learn how to manage your time very well. Can't really turn to somebody and say, hey, can you take care of this? But on the other end, having a team, you could spread that job out, or those duties out, makes it a little easier to manage. And you end up having a little bit more free time. You're not getting that 3 a.m. phone call to take care of something when there might be a team member that might be on hand that can handle it. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And let's face it, most law enforcement agencies, especially in the U.S., are under the average is under 150 sworn. So they're typically they're one-man operations or part-time operations for their PIO, versus the larger municipalities that might have 1, 2, 3, or 25.
And what advice would you give to those smaller agencies who they would not necessarily have, the daily amount of news stories that you would get in a larger city or even town, but they'll get that one job and it will completely upend them, without a doubt. There'll be one. What would you say if you're a part-time PO? What would you say to them? Say, look, it's going to happen, but there are some things that you can do. What would you say?
Well, first off, you're going to need to get your leadership behind you. And I think that's very important to impart to the leadership, that you need to have the appropriate training that you would need to handle those things. But secondly, you also need to think about how that's going to happen. So I think a lot of times, especially in law enforcement, if you're a sworn officer, you train for things over and over again. There's repetitive stuff that comes up, and you train for that. I think that's important as a PIO as well, to train for that, for those scenarios in your mind. So whether it's, you could do your own PIO manual. And I think that that's important, because if you write templates and you have a template for a particular incident, you have it pre-written out, it makes it so much easier when the incident occurs to reach for that template and say, okay, all I have to do is plug and play the different dates, times, players, and scenario location, and it saves you so much more time. And I think planning for that and training for that's important, because when the proverbial doo-doo hits the fan, it's not going to be fun, because you don't want to have that deer in the headlights look when it does unfold.
And unfortunately, I think now people can see right through you.
Yes.
It seems easier to know when someone is ill prepared. When it was a matter of getting the news at 9 a.m, 6 p.m, 10 p.m, it was like, oh yeah, they seem to know what they're talking about. But now it's just that constant onslaught, which puts the pressure. And I think people get the fear, when in actual fact you're dealing with the same type of job. You need to stop the fear from overwhelming you.
And I think that goes with being prepared. If you're prepared to, if you're thinking about your questions you're going to be asked at a press conference, and you kind of jot down the thoughts, what are they going to ask me based on what I've provided them, and you jot those questions down, and now you're prepared for them when they come, because now you may have an answer somewhat formulated in your mind. And I think that's kind of where I mean by preparing, because you're going to put a media release out, and the media is going to come and ask questions based upon that media release or whatever you say in your press conference. If you're not prepared to answer questions, you have not given just your leadership alone talking points about what they should be saying, then you're not doing yourself a good service. You're putting yourself at risk and your agency.
Absolutely. And so how would you, I mean, this is on a more sort of personal level, I suppose. I mean, I think it would be safe to say, even if people don't want to admit it, there have been times when people are scared. They've been scared and sat in the toilet and thought, oh no, what am I going to do? I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm the only one. Have you had those moments? And if so, what have you done?
I have been terrified several times, from whether it was doing a press conference in a very formalized setting where we're in the building and I've got the podium up there and you're looking at all the microphones, or the on-scene camera interview with a reporter that I've been in awe of for 10 years, and they show up at the scene and I just want to say hi to them and talk to them, but I got to go talk to them in front of the camera. So kind of what I have prepared for myself is I always kind of look through them in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking beyond them, because I know if I make individual eye contact with somebody, thought process is going to get changed. So as I'm reading from my media release or I'm answering questions, I'm usually kind of looking right over the top of their heads, because my goal is just to keep my head moving, have my talking points going forward, and not engaging them with eye-to-eye contact, because for me, that's a huge fear thing. I know if I make eye contact, I'm going to lock in on that person, and all I'm going to do is stare at that person, and I'm going to have that conversation with that person, and that can be beneficial in certain circumstances. But I think in a media press conference, you need to be talking to everybody that's out there and looking at the camera at the same time, and not staring down at one individual reporter.
And everyone has their media kryptonite, and I suppose it's about identifying what yours is and then doing whatever it takes to overcome.
And
I'm
Italian, so I talk with my hands. So I've kind of learned a lesson that if there's a podium there, I'm going to hold on to the podium, so I keep my hands still, or I have my hands in front of me and I just keep them down in front of me, because once you start flailing your hands around, it looks horrible on camera. It really does.
Yeah. And talking about sort of, I mean, you've given some great advice already. You also give training now, don't you? And what is it about that what do you get out of that? What do you enjoy about it?
So I've done social media training for law enforcement agencies. And part of that was, as I was coming up in the field, I realized there's not a whole lot of individual training out there for social media, especially when I first started doing it. And what I realized is, okay, not only do you need to learn how to use Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, because a lot of agencies didn't know how to use it, and they didn't have the young crowd that had been exposed to it for years like we have now. But the other part of it is also understanding that there's a business to using the different platforms, and understanding the benefits and the demographics that go with those individual platforms, and how to use those to target for the best. So, for example, like, you're using Facebook to talk to your middle-aged females and your older males. You're not talking to your 16, 17, 24-year-olds. But if you go to Instagram, you're talking to a much younger crowd. And with Twitter, one of the things that I found a lot of agencies did is they would just push all their media from Twitter to Facebook. And people hate that when you cross platform. So Twitter people they're like text messengers on speed. They want it quick and fast. you have to learn how to use those different platforms. And that was where I was going when I started doing training. Was I wanted to help other people do and not to make the same mistakes that I did when I first started.
Great. And I think that's the key, isn't it? It's passing on your knowledge, and not keeping it just because you can. I think that's the most important thing, because I think everyone has someone they can look to and say, that person made me who I am today in my job.
I agree. I think, we as PIOs, and when we talk about the podcast later, I think that me sharing my information is all part of me learning more about what I need to improve about what I do as well. So I think that was, for me, it's always a learning process, because somebody will come to me and say, well, how come this is doing this? And I may not have the answer, and I'm going to tell them I don't have the answer, but I'm going to go find it. And then I'm going to come back to them, and I've just learned something new because I didn't experience that problem, but somebody else did. And I'm going to go ahead and fix it.
Yeah, it's very satisfying. Yeah. And just on your point around social media, you talked about demographics, and I think that where you are, and where you were stationed for some time, as you mentioned, you're right by O'Hare, you're right outside of, on the border of Chicago, and so I can only imagine the number of stakeholders, partners, audiences, different types of communities that all have to work together, all have to work, in tandem, and you're going to have a push-pull, spider's web, whatever you do. What would you say was one of the most challenging or kind of interesting, like, say, I can only imagine you get so many international media inquiries. I always am fascinated by them and how they work. When have you had to kind of deal with that kind of challenge, and how did you deal with it?
Well, I had an interesting challenge. We had an incident involving, the community I worked in had it's pretty diverse, but it had a very large, at the time, Korean population. And we had a victim of a crime. It was a confidence crime. There was a lot of money that this Korean family had lost, and it had gotten into a Korean print newspaper in the city of Chicago. That got picked up by a South Korean news station, and then they wanted to do an on-camera interview with me remotely, and I was having a hard time understanding with the accent, and it was very difficult to understand with the accent and the language differences, and I think they were trying to get me to say something along the lines that they targeted them specifically because they were Korean, and we couldn't tell that at the time. They just targeted them because, they watched them come out of a bank with a bank bag, and they targeted them because they were walking out with a visible bank bag. And we couldn't tell if they targeted them specifically because they were Korean. And I think this was where the news station was going. And I couldn't get there with it because we didn't have that information at the time, and I wasn't going to speculate on an international news station. And it got to the point where it was almost comical, but they kept coming back to it. And I'm like, we can't say definitely one way or the other whether they were targeted because of their ethnicity or their race or their culture. We just know that they were targeted because they were observed with a bank bag. They had a visible bank bag when they walked out of the bank, and that it was comical. The whole community that I was in, because it bordered Chicago, we had all the major news stations, TV stations, and a number 3 market in the country that would pick up stories regularly, and sometimes they were big news stories, sometimes they weren't. One of the last incidents that I handled before I left was a guy that got into a road rage incident, and he ended up trying to stab a guy through a window with a big army knife. And I mean, what a battle that was to try and talk about, because it originally had gotten blown off by an officer, and then later on they had arrested the guy. So then I'm trying to explain to the news media why the incident was not initially, why the person wasn't initially arrested, why we went back and arrested him later on. And it's a small town law enforcement sometimes, or medium-sized law enforcement sometimes, does things differently than they even do in the big city. And trying to explain that to number three market news stations sometimes can be problematic.
Did you, so from that, or from both those instances, really, did you change anything or learn anything from sort of how you would handle relationships?
Well,
generally, or was it?
I had always had pretty good relationships with our news media. I mean, I never really had any difficult. They were never really out to ever like do the gotcha interview. I did have one reporter from a news station that came in when we had an officer die in the line of duty, where one of her family members went to the academy with two of our officers and came in, and they were trying to get information based on the fact that they were known to each other. And that was the only incident that I had where that reporter to me, you were never getting a story from us ever again. You came in on a false pretense to try and get a story, and that was a no-no. But I mean, other than that, I've always had very good relationships, and I've never had a problem talking to any of them. And I get they want their stories, and I just have to give them the information that I can give them.
I think professional rules of engagement exist a lot more than people realize or understand, and I think that's the fear that, again.
Well, I think professional rules of engagement are there with reporters that will follow those rules, those journalistic practices. But because there is so much push for get the news out fast and first, that sometimes those practices are most frequently pushed to the wayside just so that they can get the first story out.
And again, this comes down to technology and having to do everything 30 seconds, and people are addicted to news. So it's almost a no-win. But we'll talk about PIO Podcast shortly. I just want to ask one question. I asked this from everyone, and I know there's not one single piece of advice you could probably give someone, but a new in service or just about to start as a PIO comes to you and says, okay, what do I do? What's the best thing I can do?
I would say don't forget your counterparts that are already in the field. Network as much as you possibly can. Find your PIOs that are around you locally. Reach out to them, connect with them, become friends with them, go out to coffee with them, have conversations with them about the things that you're worried about, that you think you're lacking. They can always turn around and support you. There is not a PIO that I know in this country and internationally that I don't know that I've met via Twitter or in a training class. I can't call or send them a text message and say, hey, I've never encountered this before. Can you give me some help? And to every man and woman I've ever met, they would definitely reach out and help. So don't be afraid to reach out and talk to other PIOs, because that networking is so important.
And yourself included, I'm sure you can give a wealth of support and information.
I do try.
So on that note, PIO Podcast, very popular. For those who don't know, you should know really, but here we are on the PIO Podcast. You speak to people from all different agencies: police, fire, EMS, government, some education, I believe, or healthcare. You have set this up. It's your own thing. You just decided to do it, and it's very clearly a labour of love for you, and you keep at it regularly, and that's sort of what I admire the most about you, is your dedication to it. Why did you start? So
back in 2020, when I retired, I retired because my wife had big diagnosis with cancer, and I was going through this. I got to retire. I need to take care of my wife. I did pretty much everything I wanted to do in my career, and I'm going to take a step back. I need to take care of her. Well, she luckily came through it with flying colors, was pretty much done with it about 6 months after we had gotten the diagnosis, and she's on her way to a full 100% recovery. And I'm sitting at home. I'm 53 years old, and I'm going, the heck am I going to do? I'm retired now, and I got to figure something out. Well, I knew if things came out positive, I knew I wanted to probably get back into the field. And one of the things that I realized was it's hard to stay involved in the field unless you're actually doing something in the field. So I said, I think, I was listening to a podcast while I'm at home and helping my wife, or I was taking her to the hospital. I was listening to podcasts while I'm sitting in the hospital, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. So I start Googling podcasts, public relations podcasts. There's really not that many out there. And I started thinking, did I do one? Do I know enough people where I could reach out to them and say, hey, would you be interested in sharing what you do? And I'll do a short format so that I'm not tying you up for 2 or 3. I'm not doing a Joe Rogan show for 3 hours. They're, the 30-minute interviews, 35-minute interviews. And for me, it was like a complete learning experience because here, my first interview that I ever had was Chris Schoen, the chief of police, well, now chief of police, time deputy chief of Mountain View Police Department, pretty much the guru when it comes to dealing with social media and public relations, and his protege, Katie Nelson, who I ended up interviewing later on. And I really started, I'm like, this is, the first interview was amazing. And I was like, this is going to be good. I'm going to enjoy this. And so this became my learning process to push myself back out into the field, learn about other PIOs, learn how they do things. And it really, for me, it made me better at what I do, but it also put my name out there so that when I decided I wanted to start interviewing, my name was out there and I was interviewing, and I have knowledge in the field.
Well, you quite clearly love it. I mean, firstly, I'm so pleased about your wife. I mean, that's a challenge in itself. And this probably was also a really good way to sort of focus and, get through that. So that's fantastic. And I wish her well, both of you. But I mean, this, I think, has really opened up people's eyes to all the different types of roles there are out there. It's not just doing press releases. It's not just this. It's not just ... So, so what next? What are your plans for
so this? The PIO podcast, I'm going to go through the remainder of this year, and I just recorded my 36th episode. So I think there's 34 out right now. So I have a few, and then this one we're recording. My goal is to get through the remainder of the year. I'll probably stop right around December 1st. My goal will be then to try and record episodes. I want to do a full video podcast. So my goal is to do video then and push it out in video. And then what I would like to do is with the NIOA, as well as with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the PIO section, I'd like to see if we could come up with a training format for people that want to start their own podcast within their own municipalities. It's sometimes I think it's really expensive and tough to do, and it's really not. It's kind of a little bit of a labor of love. You have to really enjoy doing it. You have to be willing to want to sit down and edit, which can be a problem for some people. For audio is a lot different than just video. Video sometimes is so much easier to edit because of audio you find there's bumps and quirks and echoes, and the voices don't modulate right. So you gotta learn how to do that. And that was where if you listen to my first few podcasts, the audio wasn't great, the intro wasn't great, and as I started going on it got better and better. Everything I'm doing is out of pocket. I'm not getting paid for any of this. There's no profit margin in here for this. It's actually a loss margin. My wife will probably tell you that every second, that I'm losing money because to host the podcast on a site, you have to pay for the storage of that audio. And that's fine because it's really not all that expensive per month. And in the long grand scheme is I'm helping other PIOs learn other things. And that's what I want to do.
Yeah, but people can donate.
Absolutely.
I don't think you ever really mentioned that too much. So yeah, people can donate to support you, and I think everyone should. I know I've enjoyed sort of pushing it out there and seeing the response that you get to it. And I'm looking forward to see where it goes and develop more. And it is, as I say, very clear that you enjoy this. And I enjoyed being on it a lot. I think your conversational style is wonderful. And it's a shame we don't have much more time because actually you have so much to share. And we could probably do another 3. We should do a 3-parter or something.
We can.
With all your
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll just keep going. But I'm just we'll kind of lighten it up a little bit. I love Chicago. I've been a few times. I just fell in love with it the very first time I went there. So if you were to take me out for the night and show me your favorite spots, what would that comprise of?
Well, there's a couple of neat little bars in the Chicago area, and I'll give you there's there's a really neat, kind of like Hawaiian kind of tiki theme bar called Three Dots and a Dash. It literally has drinks that are like as big as your head, and they've got straws that come out of them, and they're all kinds of different flavors and fruity, and there's ones that are steaming and smoking and really cool. It's a real cool little bar. There's there's no sign. You walk through an alley to get to it. You go downstairs, and then you're in this, this really cool little area right in the River North area. So it's a real neat bar. Restaurant wise, I could say pizza, but there are so many really good Italian restaurants. There's an Italian restaurant that my family fell in love with. It's called Prosecco. Phenomenal Italian food, very small in the west end of River North, but the food is amazing. I have a gluten allergy, so for me, walking into an Italian restaurant and deal with it, and to deal with a gluten allergy is amazing, and they do really good food. So yeah, it's outstanding. So that was one place we'd go, and there's another place. It's kind of a fun thing if you like to play video games and have a cocktail and listen to a DJ. There is a really neat bar, again, in the River North area. I've spent a lot of time in River North, which is called Headquarters Beercade. And literally they have every kind of video game that you can imagine there to play.
Right.
And a lot of fun. And it's an adult theme. No kids, adult.
Fantastic. Yeah. If I'd have known that when I was at the police chief's conference, I would have been there instead.
Yeah. Well, next time you come out of here, we'll take a ride out there. Absolutely.
That's great. I have to ask you this as well. If you could do your job in any city in the world, where would you like to give it a go in the world, not just in the States?
God, in the world. Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think New York City. I'm a huge fan of Blue Bloods, and I like the dynamic of the DCPI. My wife laughs at me all the time when I talk about certain things that he's advising the chief about there, and I think about Judy Pell and when she was there, and I'll tell you, it just, that to me, New York is like the epitome of law enforcement, and the whole, as a PIO, that's where I'd want to be.
You never know.
I doubt it though.
Is there anything you'd like to say to everyone listening? So I know I've kind of taken over, and I'm sure there are other burning questions, but is there anything you'd like to say to the people that will be listening to this?
You know what? If you have questions or you want to be a guest on the show, I did put out a recent survey for people if they wanted a specific guest on the show, or somebody that I haven't thought of. I do have people lined up, but I'm still looking for more. This is a fun thing for me. I love doing this. I love interviewing different PIOs. So it's not going to stop. It's not going anywhere. I'm going to make it bigger and better as we go. My goal is to actually get out and do some remotes. I want to go on scene and do some remotes. So as this pandemic drops down, I would like to be able to do remote video as well, and do a remote interview where I'm actually sitting across from somebody and not on a Zoom interview.
Well, thank you. You've really just, I think, made things really interesting for a lot of people. We truly do appreciate what you're doing. Keep at it. Thank you. Thank you for letting me interview you. I think this is
this was awesome. I love the fact that you got to turn the tails on. It's awesome.
Yeah, I could have gone mean on you, but
that's okay. My wife would probably like
that. Okay. Thank you again, and everyone. Again, you're able to contribute if you want to help along and support. You can do that through the podcast Twitter, which is PIO Podcast, I believe. And thanks again so much.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate the interview. Thank you. And that was Robert Tornabene on the PIO Podcast. Thank you to Christine Townsend. Thank you for switching roles with me, Christine. I hope everybody liked it. Until next time, be safe, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at thepiopodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get notified of the latest episode. If you are listening on a platform that allows reviews, please give us a review. We appreciate any review, good or bad. It helps us improve on each episode. Until next time, be safe.